What dark magic is this? Your end, you! While I draw breath, then perish!
The bitter scent of wet pine and decaying leaves hung heavy in the Cascade Mountain air. It was the kind of cold that did not just chill the skin, but settled deep into the marrow of the bones. Silas moved through the gray morning mist with the slow, deliberate pace of a man who had long ago stopped rushing toward anything. At 62, his body was a map of hard miles and unforgiving winters. His canvas coat was patched at the elbows, his leather boots worn smooth by years of navigating the jagged rock and dense undergrowth of the high country. He stopped beside a rusted wire snare set near a game trail. Empty. He knelt, the joints in his knees popping loud enough to sound like dry twigs snapping. As he reached out to reset the mechanism, his left hand began to betray him. It started as a subtle vibration in the fingertips, then traveled up through the thick, jagged scars that crawled across his knuckles and disappeared beneath his flannel cuff. The tremor. It always came when the cold bit hardest. It always came when the woods went too quiet. Silas closed his eyes. The smell of the wet pine faded, replaced instantly by the metallic tang of blood and the heavy musk of a grizzly. 10 years, 10 winters had passed, yet the memory was locked behind his eyelids, sharp as broken glass. He saw the snow churn to red mud. He heard the screaming. He felt the cold steel of the rifle trigger against his index finger. 1, 2, 2, 3, 3 seconds of hesitation. 3 seconds where his grip had faltered, where his mind had frozen against the sheer violent mass of the charging beast. 3 seconds were all it took for his nephew to be torn away from this world. Silas opened his eyes. He exhaled a long, ragged breath that materialized as a thick white plume in the freezing air. He grabbed his trembling left hand with his right, squeezing the scarred flesh until the knuckles turned white, forcing the tremor to subside by sheer physical will. He did not curse. He did not sigh. He simply picked up his lever-action rifle, a heavy .4, 5-70, that he kept cleaner than his own cabin, and stood up. There was no changing the past. There was only the trap line, the encroaching winter, and the quiet isolation he had condemned himself to. He turned to continue up the ridge. Then the forest tore open. It was a sound that did not belong in the quiet rhythm of the morning. A high, desperate crack of splintering wood followed immediately by a deep guttural roar that rattled the loose stones beneath Silas's boots. It was not a bear. It was a wild boar, but the resonance of the roar suggested something unnaturally large, something driven mad by hunger or territory. Silas did not think. The instincts forged over 40 years in the wilderness took over. He dropped his pack. He checked the chamber of his rifle with a flick of his thumb. A brass cartridge gleamed dull in the low light. He pushed the lever back into place, the mechanical click satisfying and solid. He moved toward the sound, his footsteps suddenly entirely silent on the damp earth. He navigated through the thicket of black birch and towering firs, tracking the violent grunts and the frantic sound of boots slipping on wet bark. He crested a small rise and looked down into a narrow ravine. The mist was thicker here, pooling at the bottom near the banks of a half-frozen creek. What he saw made him stop entirely. Down in the mud, a massive wild boar was tearing at the roots of a fallen, rotting cedar. The beast was a nightmare of matted black bristles and yellowed, curving tusks, its shoulders packed with dense, twitching muscle. It was aggressively ramming the thick trunk of the fallen tree, trying to dislodge whatever was trapped on top of it. Silas lifted his gaze to the top of the suspended log. It was not a lost hiker. It was not a mountain lion. It was a woman, but not a human woman. She was massive, her frame broad and powerfully built, clad in torn leathers and furs that were soaked dark with water and blood. Her skin was a dull olive green, scarred with the pale white lines of old battles. An orc. Silas had seen them before years ago during the bloody border skirmishes that had left the frontier in ashes. They were the enemy. They were the monsters from the stories told to frighten children. But there was no malice in her right now. There was only absolute primal desperation. She was balancing precariously on the slick, rotting bark of the cedar suspended 10 feet above the snapping jaws of the boar. Her left leg was torn open from the calf to the knee, a jagged, horrific gash that dripped thick, dark blood down the side of the log. The boar was tasting it, driven into a frenzy by the scent. But the woman was not fighting back. She was not holding a weapon. Both of her massive muscular arms were wrapped tightly around a small bundle pressed fiercely to her chest. A child. Silas caught a glimpse of a small face peering out from beneath a heavy wool blanket. A little boy, no more than 2 years old. His wide, terrified eyes were locked onto his mother's face. The orc woman leaned over, using her own broad back as a shield, murmuring something low and rhythmic in her guttural tongue, trying to calm the boy, even as her own blood painted the wood beneath them. The log gave a sickening crack. The roots holding it aloft were giving way under the boar's relentless assault. The woman slipped her torn leg, failing her. She dropped to one knee, clutching the child tighter, burying his face in her shoulder so he would not see the beast waiting below. Silas felt it then, the sudden violent seizing of his chest. His left hand began to shake. The rifle barrel wavered. The mist shifted, and for a fraction of a second, the green skin of the orc woman vanished. Silas did not see a monster. He saw his nephew. He saw the snow. He saw the inevitable tragedy unfolding exactly as it had 10 years ago. 1. The boar took a few steps back, lowering its massive head, preparing for a full-speed charge to shatter the remaining roots of the log. 2. The tremor in Silas's hand became violent. The rifle felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. The ghost of his failure screamed in his ears, paralyzing his muscles. He was going to watch another child die. He was going to stand in the trees and do nothing. The boar charged. Silas's jaw locked. His teeth ground together with enough force to crack enamel. The muscles in his forearms coiled like steel cables. He did not try to stop the shaking. He embraced the cold. He embraced the phantom pain, and he forced it all down into the wooden stock of the rifle. His left hand went dead still, still as a stone in a frozen river. He exhaled. He pulled the trigger. The 45-70 roared a deafening crack of thunder that shattered the morning silence. A massive plume of white smoke erupted from the muzzle. Down in the ravine, the charging boar's front legs buckled instantly. The heavy caliber slug struck it perfectly behind the shoulder, shattering bone and tearing through the heart. The beast plowed into the mud, its momentum carrying it forward until it slammed lifelessly against the base of the fallen cedar. Silence slammed back down onto the forest, ringing in Silas's ears. Slowly the smoke cleared. On the log, the orc woman had squeezed her eyes shut, her body braced for the fall that never came. She opened her eyes, chest heaving, staring down at the dead beast. Then her head snapped up. Her eyes, a piercing feral yellow, locked onto the tree line where Silas stood. Silas did not hide. He lowered the rifle from his shoulder, but kept it held across his chest. He stepped out from behind the black birch and began to walk down the slope. He watched her posture change instantly. The desperation vanished, replaced by a terrifying, coiled aggression. Even wounded, even bleeding out, she looked like she could tear him limb from limb. She shifted her weight, placing herself entirely between Silas and the child. She bared her teeth, a low, warning growl vibrating in her throat. She expected him to raise the gun again. She expected the human to finish what the boar had started. Silas stopped 10 paces away. He looked at the dead boar. He looked at her torn leg. Then he looked at the child. The little boy torn peeked around his mother's broad arm. He was shivering, his tiny face smeared with dirt. He looked at Silas not with hatred, but with the hollow glazed stare of a creature that had been running for too long and had eaten too little. Silas reached into the deep pocket of his canvas coat. The orc woman tensed her muscles, bunching, preparing to lunge off the log and take the bullet if it meant crushing the human's skull. Silas's hand emerged from his pocket. He was not holding a pistol. He was holding a piece of dried venison wrapped in wax paper. He didn't say a word. He didn't offer a reassuring smile. He simply tossed the small package underhanded. It landed softly on the dry section of the log, right near the little boy's hands. The woman stared at the meat. Then she stared at Silas. Her yellow eyes narrowed, calculating the trick, searching for the poison, the trap. Silas broke eye contact. He turned his back to them, an act of supreme vulnerability in the wild. He walked over to the dead boar, drew his hunting knife, and began the practical necessary work of bleeding the animal. He made himself busy. He made himself non-threatening by completely ignoring them. Minutes passed. The only sound was the wind through the pines and the scraping of Silas's blade. Then he heard the faint crinkle of wax paper. He glanced over his shoulder. The little boy was chewing frantically on the tough venison, his small hands clutching it like a lifeline. The mother was watching Silas, her chest still heaving, but the feral growl had stopped. She was losing too much blood. Her face was growing pale, the green of her skin turning to a sickly ashen gray. She swayed slightly on the log. Silas wiped his blade on his trousers and sheathed it. He slung his rifle over his shoulder. He walked over to the log and stopped at the base. He looked up at her. "Can you walk?" he asked. His voice was gravel rough from disuse. She stared down at him. She did not understand the words, or perhaps she did and refused to answer. She gripped the child tighter. Silas pointed to her bleeding leg, then pointed back up the ridge in the direction of his cabin. He raised both hands, palms open and empty. He waited. The woman looked at his scarred, trembling left hand. She looked at his steady, quiet eyes. She knew she was dying out here. If the cold didn't take them tonight, the wolves would track her blood by sunset. She had run out of choices. Slowly, agonizingly, she slid down the side of the log. Her boots hit the mud, and her wounded leg instantly gave out. Silas stepped forward, catching her by the thick leather of her shoulder harness before she hit the ground. She was incredibly heavy, dense with muscle and bone. She flinched violently at his touch, a reflex born of violence and survival. Silas did not flinch back. He braced his stance, taking her weight. He did not try to take the boy. He knew better than to touch a wounded mother's cub. He turned acting as a living crutch and began the slow, brutal trek up the mountain. It took them over an hour to cover the 2 miles to the cabin. The wind picked up, driving icy needles of sleet into their faces. Valia leaned heavily on the old hunter, her breathing ragged and shallow. Every step was a battle against gravity and blood loss. Silas did not complain. He did not ask her name. He just kept a steady, punishing rhythm, his boots breaking the frozen crust of the earth. When the small timber-framed cabin finally appeared through the trees, smoke curling lazily from the stone chimney, Valia stumbled. Silas caught her again, practically dragging her up the wooden steps and onto the porch. He kicked the heavy oak door open. The interior was warm, smelling of cedarwood, dried tobacco, and old leather. It was a single large room. A heavy iron stove sat in the center, radiating heat. A simple cot rested against one wall, a work table covered in wood shavings and carving tools against the other. It was the home of a man who lived entirely within his own mind. Silas guided her inside. The moment they crossed the threshold, Valia pulled away from him. She staggered to the farthest, darkest corner of the cabin, pressing her back against the rough-hewn logs. She slid down to the floor, pulling Torin into her lap, wrapping her massive arms in the thick blanket around him until the boy was completely hidden from view. She watched Silas with unblinking, predatory eyes. If he moved toward them, she would fight to the death. She was trapped in a box with a human. All her instincts screamed at her to kill him before he killed them. Silas did not look at her. He walked to the iron stove. He took a heavy cast-iron kettle, poured water from a bucket into it, and set it over the hottest part of the iron. He opened a small wooden cabinet on the wall. He pulled out a large roll of clean white linen. He grabbed a glass jar filled with dried yarrow root and a tin of pine resin salve. He walked to the heavy oak dining table in the center of the room. He set the linen and the tin down on the wood. He made sure the items were clearly visible. Then he walked to the corner of the room where he kept his coats. He took down a heavy wool blanket and tossed it onto the end of the table. He still hadn't looked at her. Silas walked back to the stove. He picked up his pipe from the mantelpiece. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his folding pocket knife and a small block of unfinished cedar wood. He walked to the front door. He opened it, letting a blast of freezing mountain air into the warm cabin. He stepped out onto the porch. He pulled the heavy oak door shut behind him with a firm, solid click. Outside, the wind howled through the pines. Silas sat down in a rocking chair on the porch. He packed his pipe with the tobacco. He struck a match, cupping the flame with his scarred left hand, shielding it from the wind. He took a long, slow draw, the cherry glowing bright red in the gathering twilight. He placed the cold block of cedar in his lap. He opened his knife. He began to whittle, shaving thin, even ribbons of wood onto the porch floorboards. Inside the cabin, Valia sat in the dark corner listening. She heard the wind outside. She heard the water beginning to boil on the stove. She looked at the medical supplies sitting on the table, bathed in the warm orange glow of the firelight. She looked at the heavy wooden door. She listened for the sound of boots approaching it. She listened for the click of a rifle mechanism. There was nothing. Only the faint, rhythmic sound of a knife shaving wood on the porch outside. The human was not locking them in. He was locking himself out. He had given them his fire, his medicine, his shelter, and he had removed the only threat in the room himself. For the first time in weeks, the crushing grip of panic in Valia's chest began to loosen. She looked down at Torin. The boy had fallen asleep, his small chest rising and falling evenly, the warmth of the cabin finally thawing his little bones. Valia looked back at the door. She slowly reached out, grabbing the thick linen and the jar of yarrow root from the table. She pulled them into the shadows. She began the agonizing work of cleaning her wound, the silence of the cabin broken only by the crackle of the fire. Outside, the snow began to fall, dusting the shoulders of Silas's coat. He didn't move to go inside. He just sat in the biting cold, smoking his pipe, his knife carving rhythmically into the cedar block. His left hand did not shake once. For the first time in 10 years, the ghost of the boy in the snow was quiet. He had not hesitated. He had pulled the trigger. He didn't know who the green-skinned tote woman was. He didn't know what army had left those scars on her arms or what she was running from. He didn't care. Out here past the tree line, the world of men and their politics meant nothing. Out here, there was only the cold, the dark, and what a man chose to do when the wolves came knocking. Silas blew a ring of blue smoke into the freezing night. The cedar shavings piled up around his boots. He would sit out here until the fire inside died down. He would give her the night. Tomorrow would bring whatever tomorrow brought. But tonight, nobody else was going to die in his woods. The first 14 days were defined entirely by the things they did not say. In the deep timber of the Cascades, silence is not an empty space. It is a heavy living weight. It filled the air between the crackling of the cast iron stove and the relentless driving howl of the northern wind. Survival out here did not require conversation. It required calories, dry wood, and a constant, unwavering vigilance. Silas fell back into the rhythm of a man who worked from dawn until dusk, simply to keep his own mind quiet. He woke before the sun, the frost on the window panes glowing a pale, ghostly blue. He checked his rifle. He checked the heavy deadbolts on the oak door. Then he went out into the biting freeze to split firewood. The heavy steel maul rose and fell in a metronomic arc. Wood splintered. Bark flew. His breath plumed like locomotive steam in the 0-degree air. He did not ask the orc woman for her history. He did not ask what army had branded the jagged white scars across her immense olive-green shoulders. Inside the cabin, Valia established her own silent parameters. At first, she remained confined to the darkest corner, her massive frame curled protectively around the toddler Torin. Her yellow eyes tracked Silas's every movement, analyzing his gait, his reach, the placement of his knives. She was a coiled spring ready to snap at the first sign of betrayal. But the betrayal never came. Instead, Silas left plates of salted pork and mashed root vegetables on the edge of the table. He filled the water bucket. He stoked the fire, and he kept his distance. By the end of the first week, the crushing grip of Valia's paranoia began to thaw. She realized the old human was not fattening them up for a bounty. He was simply keeping them alive. Slowly, she began to move around the cabin. Her left leg was tightly bound in Silas's clean linen and packed with his drawing salves, forcing her to walk with a heavy, pronounced limp. She did not offer thanks. Orcs did not deal in the currency of gratitude. They dealt in utility. She began to earn her keep. Silas would return from checking his snare lines to find the cabin swept clean of tracked-in mud. He would find his torn wool socks clumsily but securely stitched together with sinew. He would find wild garlic and wintercress dug from beneath the snowpack added to his otherwise bland venison stews. They moved around each other like two solitary predators, forced to share a small cave, respecting the boundaries, communicating through the shared labor of staying alive. Then came the morning. The temperature plummeted so fast the sap in the pine trees froze and cracked like rifle shots. Silas was at the chopping block behind the cabin. He swung the maul, driving it deep into a knotty round of oak. He went to wrench the handle free, but his left hand locked. The cold had bypassed his leather gloves and sunk straight into the ruined nerves of his scars. A spasm of pure, blinding agony shot up his forearm. His fingers curled inward, locking into a rigid, trembling claw. He dropped the maul. He fell to his knees in the snow, clutching his left wrist with his right hand, his teeth ground together so hard his jaw ached. He tried to force the fingers open, but the muscle had seized entirely. The phantom pain of the bear attack, the ghost of his failure 10 years ago flared in his mind, paralyzing him. He didn't hear the cabin door open. He didn't hear the footsteps in the snow. Suddenly, a shadow fell over him. Silas looked up, his breath ragged. Valia stood towering above him, the winter wind whipping her dark braided hair. She wore his spare canvas coat, the shoulders straining against her muscular frame. She looked down at him, her yellow eyes unreadable. She knelt in the snow. She did not ask if he was all right. She did not offer empty pity. She reached out with both of her hands. They were massive, easily twice the size of his, the skin rough as sandstone, the knuckles thick with bone and callus. She gently but firmly pried his right hand away from his crippled left. Silas tensed his instincts, screaming at him to pull away. But he didn't. Valia enveloped his trembling, scarred hand between her two immense palms. Her skin was unnaturally hot, radiating a deep furnace-like heat that humans simply did not possess. She held his hand firmly, applying a steady, even pressure. She closed her eyes, murmuring a low, rhythmic cadence in her own guttural tongue. The heat seeped through his leather glove. It sank into his skin, melting the frost in his blood, relaxing the violently contracted tendons. The tremor slowed. The pain began to recede, retreating back into the dark corners of his memory. They stayed like that in the snow for 3 full minutes. The old human hunter and the fugitive orc. No words, no debts, just a silent transfer of warmth from someone who had strength to someone who had temporarily lost it. When Silas's fingers finally uncurled, Valia released him. She stood up, turned and walked back into the cabin without a backward glance. Silas picked up his maul. His hand was steady. Everything shifted after that morning. The invisible wall between them did not vanish, but it lowered. A few evenings later, the cabin was suffocatingly warm. The iron stove was roaring, radiating a deep red heat that made the cedar logs pop and hiss. Silas sat at his workbench near the window. A kerosene lantern cast a warm, golden circle of light over his tools. He was holding the block of cedar he had started carving on the porch the night he brought them in. Over the past few weeks, under the slow, patient strokes of his knife, the block had taken the shape of a small, stout bear. He was sanding the edges smooth, ensuring there were no splinters. Torrin was exploring the cabin. The 2-year-old was wearing an old red flannel shirt of Silas's, the sleeves rolled up 6 times, the hem dragging on the floorboards like a robe. The boy was growing bolder. He waddled around the legs of the heavy oak table, his small green hands patting the grain of the wood. Valia stood by the stove stirring a pot of broth, but her eyes were always on the boy. Torrin waddled towards Silas's workbench. Beneath the bench lay a small mountain of soft solder shavings, the accumulation of Silas's evening whittling. The boy stared at the pile, mesmerized. He took a step forward. His oversized flannel shirt caught on the edge of a loose floorboard. Torrin tripped. He pitched forward, his arms flailing and face planted directly into the pile of cedar shavings. The cabin went dead silent. Valia dropped the wooden spoon. She spun around, her muscles instantly bunching to lunge across the room, anticipating the wail of pain, the crying, the crisis. Silas saw it happen. He saw the boy hit the soft shavings. He saw the mother panic. And for a fraction of a second, the stoic, hardened shell of the old hunter cracked. Silas stood up from his stool. As he did, he deliberately hooked the toe of his heavy leather boot behind the leg of the bench. He threw his weight backward, letting his arms flail exactly as the boy's had. With a loud, dramatic clatter, the 62-year-old man crashed to the floorboards, landing flat on his back right next to the pile of shavings. He let out an exaggerated, winded grunt, staring up at the ceiling beams. Torrin lifted his face from the sawdust. Wood shavings were stuck to his nose and his forehead. He looked at the massive man lying on the floor beside him. The boy's lip had been quivering, preparing to cry. Instead, Torrin blinked. He reached out and patted Silas's gray beard. Then the boy giggled, a bright, ringing sound that defied the grim reality of the world outside the cabin walls. Silas turned his head and looked at the boy. The corners of the old man's mouth twitched. He let out a low, gravelly chuckle, brushing a piece of cedar from the boy's nose. By the stove, Valia froze. She stared at the old human sprawled on the floor, making a fool of himself just to stop her son from crying. She stared at the child, safe and laughing. The tension in her jaw snapped. The wall she had built over a lifetime of war, betrayal, and flight suddenly crumbled. A sound escaped her throat. It started as a breath, heavy and shaking. Then it deepened, rising from her chest. It was a rich, booming sound. It was raw, unpracticed, and incredibly beautiful. Valia laughed. It was the first time she had laughed in years. It filled the cabin, drowning out the wind outside. Silas sat up, resting his forearms on his knees, and looked at her. He saw the hard, feral lines of her face soften. He saw the exhaustion melt away, leaving behind a woman who was just a mother, relieved and warm. The air in the room changed. The survival pact had ended. Something else had begun. Later that night, the wind picked up again, battering the roof of the cabin. Torn was fast asleep on the cot, tucked beneath 3 heavy wool blankets. Silas sat in his rocking chair by the hearth. He held a tin cup of black coffee, the steam rising in front of his face. Valia sat on the floorboards a few feet away, her back resting against the stone masonry of the chimney. She was mending a tear in Torn's blanket. They had sat like this a dozen times before, wrapped in their mutual silence. But tonight the silence felt different. It was no longer a shield. It was a space waiting to be filled. Silas stared into the glowing embers. The firelight danced across the deep ravines of his face. He looked down at his left hand resting on his knee. The scars pulsed faintly in the heat. 10 years, Silas said. His voice was quiet, barely louder than the crackling wood. Valia stopped her stitching. She did not look up, but she tilted her head slightly, listening. 10 years ago this January, Silas continued. His sentences were short-clipped. He was not a man used to opening his chest and showing his wounds. Every word was dragged out of him. My brother's boy, name was Elias, 14 years old, bright kid, talked too much. Silas took a slow sip of the bitter coffee. It tasted like ash. Took him out to the North Ridge, teaching him to track. The winter was brutal that year. Game was scarce. We were walking a dry creek bed. The wind was at our backs. We never smelled it coming. Silas's right hand gripped the armrest of the rocking chair. His knuckles turned white. A grizzly, old male, starving to death. Mad with hunger, it came out of the brookage 50 yards away. It didn't roar. It didn't posture. It just charged, straight for Elias. Valia's eyes remained fixed on the blanket in her hands. Her needle hovered motionless. I had the rifle raised, Silas said, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. I had the sights leveled on its chest. I had the shot. He closed his eyes. The memory played in real time, inescapable and punishing. I don't know why. I don't know what broke in my head, but my finger wouldn't pull. I froze. I watched it cover the ground. I watched it hit him. I waited. Silas opened his eyes. They were completely dry. He had run out of tears a decade ago. Now there was only the cold, hard rock of his own guilt. 3 seconds. That's how long I hesitated. 3 seconds. I finally pulled the trigger. Dropped the beast, but it was too late. He was gone before I reached him. Silas set the tin cup down on the stone hearth. He reached out and picked up a piece of kindling. He gripped it with both hands. His blood was on the snow, and it was my fault. I was supposed to be the wall between him and the wild, and the wall crumbled. With a sudden, violent crack, the thick piece of kindling snapped in half in Silas's hands. He threw the broken pieces into the fire, watching the flames consume them. He leaned back in the chair, his jaw set, waiting for the judgment. He had just confessed his greatest sin, his ultimate failure as a protector. He expected her to pity him. He expected her to despise him. In the brutal logic of the wilderness, weakness was a capital offense. Valia slowly set the needle and the blanket down on the floor. She did not say it wasn't his fault. She did not offer hollow human platitudes about forgiveness or the will of the gods. She knew the reality of violence. She knew that some blood never washes off. She shifted her weight, sliding across the floorboards until she was sitting directly beside his rocking chair. She leaned her heavy green shoulder against the side of his leg. Then, with an exhale that seemed to empty her lungs of every defense she had ever built, she lowered her head and rested it against his knee. Silas froze. The apex predator. The warrior who had been willing to tear his throat out just weeks ago. She was exposing her neck. She was yielding her guard entirely. It was the absolute unspoken declaration of trust. I know what you failed to do, the gesture said, But I know what you did for me. I see you. Slowly, Silas lowered his right hand. He let it rest gently on the crown of her thick, dark hair. He did not stroke it. He just kept his hand there, a silent anchor in the dark. The tremor in his left hand was completely gone. For the next 2 weeks, the cabin felt like an island of peace in a hostile world. They fell into a seamless partnership. They ate together. They sat by the fire together. Silas taught Torrin how to stack kindling. Valia showed Silas how to weave tight, waterproof baskets from dried river reeds. But the wilderness never allows peace to last. It only grants a reprieve before it collects its toll. It started on a Tuesday. Valia woke up shivering despite the heavy blankets. By midday, she could not stand. Silas peeled back the linen bandages on her leg. The gash had closed, but the flesh around it was swollen and radiating heat. A faint, angry red line was creeping up her thigh, heading straight for the femoral artery infection. The boar's tusk had driven bacteria deep into the muscle, and despite Silas's herbs, it had festered. By nightfall, the fever hit her like a sledgehammer. Her massive body thrashed on the narrow cot. Sweat slicked her green skin, making her shine like wet stone in the lantern light. Her breathing was shallow, a wet rattling sound that filled the small cabin. Torrin sat in the corner, clutching the wooden bear Silas had carved for him, his large eyes wide with terror as he watched his mother unravel. Silas worked frantically. He boiled water, he crushed willow bark for the pain, and packed the wound with a fresh, aggressive poultice of garlic and pine pitch. He placed cold, wet cloths across her burning forehead, replacing them every few minutes. Midnight came and went. The fever spiked higher. Valia slipped into delirium. The present faded, replaced by the nightmares of her past. She began to fight. Her broad arms flailed, striking the wooden wall of the cabin with enough force to rattle the timber. She was shouting in her native tongue, her voice cracking with fury and panic. She was not fighting a boar. She was fighting ghosts. "I will not," she screamed in broken, heavily accented English, her eyes wide open but seeing nothing. "I am not cattle. I will not mate him." Silas grabbed her wrist, using all his leverage to hold her down to keep her from tearing her stitches open. "Hold still," he grunted, his boots slipping on the floorboards. "Valia, you have to hold still." She didn't hear him. She bucked violently. "I am the blood," she roared. "I am the line. You cannot force the line." With a sudden, terrifying surge of strength, she ripped her right arm free from Silas's grip. Her hands swung out, catching the leather pouch that hung from her belt. The heavy leather strap snapped. The pouch hit the floor. Something spilled out of it, sliding across the worn floorboards and stopping inches from the iron stove. It made a heavy, dull, metallic sound. It was not a coin. It was not a tool. Valia suddenly went limp. The burst of adrenaline burned out, leaving her completely depleted. Her eyes rolled back, and she collapsed onto the mattress, her chest heaving, her body consumed by the fire in her blood. Silas stood over her, his own chest heaving, his shirt soaked with her sweat and his own. He pressed a fresh, cold cloth to her forehead. Her breathing steadied slightly. She was under deep in the dark. Silas turned his head. He looked at the object near the stove. He walked over and knelt. He picked it up. It was heavy, unnaturally heavy for its size. It was a jagged medallion, roughly the size of a man's palm, forged from a dark, non-reflective metal. Black steel. It was cool to the touch, and its edges were sharp. Deeply etched into the center of the metal was the crest of a shattered tusk crossing a bloodied spear. Silas had been a scout during the border wars. He had interrogated prisoners. He had seen the banners carried by the advancing hordes. He knew the markings of the tribes. This was not a soldier's tag. This was not a merchant's coin. This was the royal seal of the Iron Fang clan, the ruling house of the Southern Territories. Silas stared at the black steel resting in his calloused palm. The pieces of the puzzle violently slammed into place. The scars on her arms were not just from battle. They were ritualistic burns. Her massive size, her unyielding pride, the absolute terror in her eyes when she thought about going back. She was not just an orc woman who had run afoul of a local chieftain. She was a princess. She was the heir to a bloodline that commanded tens of thousands of warriors. And she had taken the only male heir, the boy sleeping in the corner, and vanished into the night to escape a forced political marriage. Silas closed his fist around the medallion. The air in the cabin suddenly felt incredibly thin. He wasn't just harboring a fugitive. He was harboring the most hunted entity in the entire frontier. If the local human militias found out she was here, they would hang her from the nearest bridge to send a message. If the Iron Fang trackers found her, they would burn this entire mountain range to the ground to retrieve her. He looked at Torin. The boy had fallen asleep, sitting up, his small head resting against the wooden bear. He looked at Velia. Her face was pale, her breathing shallow. She looked fragile. She didn't look like a warlord. She looked like a mother who had sacrificed everything, stripped herself of all power and title, just to give her son a chance to breathe free air. Silas stood up. He walked to the window. The snow was falling heavily now, burying the tracks, burying the cabin, burying them in the silence of the wild. He did not reach for his rifle. He did not look at the door. Silas slipped the black steel medallion deep into his own pocket. He walked back to the cot. He pulled the chair up close, sat down, and gently wiped the sweat from the sleeping princess's brow. Her titles did not matter here. The armies searching for her did not matter here. He had let a child die in the snow once. He would be damned to hell before he let anyone take this family from his cabin. The fever broke 3 days later. Velia opened her eyes. The cabin was quiet. The smell of cedar smoke hung in the air. Silas was sitting at the table running an oiled rag over the barrel of his 45-70. She felt weak, but the fire in her blood was gone. She reached down to her belt, instinctively searching for the pouch. Her fingers found the broken leather strap. Her heart stopped. She bolted upright, panic flaring in her yellow eyes. She looked frantically around the floor. Looking for this, Velia's head snapped toward the table. Silas was holding the black steel medallion between his thumb and forefinger. The metal caught the dull light of the lantern. He did not look angry. He did not look afraid. He just looked tired. Velia froze, her breath caught in her throat. The secret was out. The death sentence was signed. She braced herself for the betrayal, for the demands, for the chains. Silas tossed the medallion. It flew through the air in a lazy arc and landed perfectly on the wool blanket covering her lap. "Keep it hidden," Silas said quietly, returning his attention to the rifle barrel. "The metal shines too much when the fire hits it. Might catch the wrong eye." Velia stared at the medallion in her lap. She stared at the old man. "You know what this means," she whispered, her voice hoarse from the fever. "You know what I am." Silas slid the bolt of the rifle back with a sharp metallic clack. He looked up to his pale blue eyes locking onto hers. They were eyes that had seen the worst of the world and had chosen in the twilight of his life to build something better. "I know what you are," Silas said. His voice was steady as a mountain stone. "You're Torin's mother, and you're terrible at making venison stew. Needs more salt." He raised the rifle to his shoulder, checking the sights against the window light. "Rest up, Velia. Wood needs chopping tomorrow, and my back ain't what it used to be." He lowered the gun and went back to polishing the steel. Velia closed her hand over the cold black metal of her past, pulled the heavy wool blanket up to her chin, and for the first time in her life, she felt entirely safe. The deep freeze of February slowly gave way to the bruised gray skies of early March. The snowpack in the Cascades did not melt all at once. It retreated inch by agonizing inch, revealing the dark, wet earth beneath. Inside the cabin, a new rhythm had taken root. It was not the frantic, desperate survival of the first month. It was the quiet, deliberate machinery of a shared life. Silas no longer smoked his pipe on the freezing porch to give Velia space. He smoked it by the hearth, the sweet scent of cherrywood tobacco, mingling with the smell of drying herbs and roasting meat. Velia no longer huddled in the darkest corner of the room. She claimed the heavy oak chair by the window, her massive hands working fluidly as she repaired Silas's old snowshoes with strips of cured leather. They did not speak of the black steel medallion hidden in the floorboards. They did not speak of the armies that were surely scouring the lower valleys. They spoke only of the immediate world, the shifting of the wind, the depth of the frost, the tracks left by the winter-starved elk on the northern ridge. Torin was the bridge between them. The 2-year-old boy had lost the hollow, haunted look of a hunted animal. He had grown sturdy on Silas's venison and Velia's relentless care. He shadowed Silas everywhere. When the old man split kindling, Torin stood a safe distance away, mimicking the swing of the axe with a small, fallen pine branch. When Silas cleaned his rifle, Torin sat on the floor watching the brass cartridges gleam in the lantern light with absolute silent reverence. Silas pretended to find the boy a nuisance, but every evening without fail there was a new carving waiting on the boy's cot. A wolf, an eagle, a horse. Silas's scarred left hand, once a useless, trembling claw of regret, had found its dexterity again. The ghost of his nephew no longer screamed in the quiet moments. The phantom pain had been replaced by the weight of the little wooden figures. It was a Tuesday morning when the illusion of safety shattered. The first sign was not a sound. It was a feeling. Silas was sitting at the table at a cup of black coffee resting on the scarred wood. He watched the dark surface of the liquid. A series of faint concentric rings rippled outward from the center of the mug. The water in the wash basin trembled. The cast iron skillet, hanging from the ceiling hook, gave a microscopic sway. Silas set his jaw. He looked up. Vela had already stopped working. She was standing perfectly still by the window, her head tilted slightly toward the glass. Her olive-green skin seemed to pale in the morning light. Her yellow eyes dilated, stripping away the mother, stripping away the companion of the hearth, leaving only the hunted combat veteran. Then came the sound. It was a low rhythmic thunder rolling up the mountain pass. It did not belong to the erratic patterns of thunder or the tumbling of falling rock. It was disciplined. It was uniform. It was the heavy synchronized strike of iron-shod hooves against the frozen earth. Many hooves, massive beasts. "Get away from the glass," Silas said. His voice was a flat, low rasp. Valia did not hesitate. She moved with terrifying speed, sweeping Torrin off the floor mid-stride and retreating to the solid timber wall near the fireplace, out of the line of sight from the window. She pressed the boy against her chest, her massive arms shielding him completely. Silas stood up. He walked to the door. He threw the heavy iron deadbolt into place. It landed with a grim final clack. He moved to the window, keeping his body pressed flat against the wall, and peered through the edge of the frosted pane. Through the skeletal branches of the winter pine, shadows were emerging from the mist. They were not human men on quarter horses. They were Iron Fang cavalry. There were a dozen of them. They rode massive armored warwargs, beasts that were half wolf, half bear, their breasts steaming in the cold air, their jaws dripping with thick saliva. The riders were giants clad in overlapping plates of dark riveted iron and thick furs. They carried long curved halberds and heavy crossbows slung across their broad backs. At the center of the formation rode a chieftain. His armor was marked with the white paint of a shattered tusk. His face was a map of brutal warfare, half of it covered by a jagged iron mask that bolted directly into his jaw. They did not rush the cabin. They did not shout. They moved with the cold, absolute certainty of an execution squad that had finally cornered its prey. The cavalry spread out in a wide arc entirely surrounding the front clearing of the cabin. The warwargs growled, a sound that vibrated deep in Silas's chest, making the floorboards hum beneath his boots. The chieftain pulled back on his heavy leather reins. His mount stopped 10 yards from the porch. The silence that followed was suffocating. It was the silence of a tightened noose. "We know you are in there, blood of the Iron Fang," the chieftain's voice boomed. It was a horrific sound, heavily accented, grating, like two massive stones grinding together. He spoke in English, a deliberate insult, projecting his voice, so the human inside would understand exactly what was about to happen. "The hunt is over. The warlord demands his bride. The clan demands its heir." Inside the cabin, Torrin whimpered. Valia clamped her large hand gently over his mouth. She closed her eyes. Her breathing became shallow, rapid. The walls of the cabin, the warmth of the fire, the smell of the cedar, it was all dissolving. The nightmare had caught her. The political machine of her race, the meat grinder of alliances and forced breeding, had finally tracked her to the edge of the world. "Human," the chieftain called out. The warwarg beneath him shifted its massive claws, tearing gouges into the frozen dirt. "You have harbored stolen property. By the laws of the frontier, we hold the right to burn this structure to the ash. Open the door. Send out the princess and the boy. Do this, and you may keep your miserable life." Silas stepped away from the window. He walked to the corner of the room. He picked up his lever-action 4570. He checked the loading gate. It was full. A massive, heavy lead slug sitting in the chamber. He pulled the hammer back to half-cock. The metallic clicks were incredibly loud in the dead silence of the room. Valia watched him. She saw the gray in his beard. She saw the age in the stoop of his shoulders. She saw the deep, brutal scars mapping his left hand. He was one old man, a forgotten relic of the frontier living in a shack. Outside were 12 of the deadliest apex predators to ever walk the continent. If he fired a shot, they would not just kill him. They would tear him to pieces. They would burn the cabin down around him, and they would take her anyway. Valia made her decision. She lowered Torin to the floor. She pointed a thick green finger at the space behind the heavy iron stove. It was the safest, darkest corner. "Stay," she whispered in her native tongue. The boy obeyed, his eyes wide, his lip trembling, shrinking back into the shadows. Valia stood up. She straightened her spine. The hunted, desperate mother vanished. The princess of the Iron Fang clan took her place. She stood at her full, terrifying height, her jaw set, her fists clenched at her sides. She took a step toward the door. "No." The word was quiet, but it hit the air like a physical blow. Valia stopped. Silas had stepped directly into her path. He stood between her and the heavy oak door. He did not raise his voice. He did not strike a dramatic pose. He simply stood there, an immovable object rooted deep into the floorboards of his home. Valia looked down at him. "You heard him, Silas," she said, her voice cracking, the English heavy and broken. "They will burn you. They will kill you slow. You cannot fight this." "I've fought worse," Silas said flatly. "This is not your war," she pleaded, the desperation finally bleeding through her royal facade. "I brought this to your door. You gave me fire. You gave me time. Do not give me your blood. I am the princess of the Iron Fang. It is my duty to go." Silas reached out. He placed his left hand, his ruined, scarred, trembling left hand, squarely against her chest. Valia froze. She looked down at his hand. It was not shaking, not a millimeter, not a fraction. The fingers were locked like bands of cold, forged steel against her leather tunic. The phantom pain, the crippling hesitation that had plagued him for a decade was entirely, utterly gone. Silas looked up into her yellow eyes. "I don't see a princess," Silas said, his voice a gravelly, vibrating rumble that carried the weight of a 10-year penance. He thumbed the hammer of his rifle all the way back. "I see my family, and nobody takes my family out of this house." Valia's breath caught in her throat. Her eyes widened. The absolute unyielding certainty in the old man's face broke something deep inside her. A single hot tear traced a clean line down her dusty green cheek. She did not argue. She did not move. She let the old hunter stand his ground. Outside, the chieftain grew impatient. "Your time is gone, human," the orc roared. Brush. He drew his massive halberd and the iron blade catching the dull winter light. "Burn it down, take the female from the ashes." Two of the cavalrymen dismounted, pulling heavy pitch-soaked torches from their saddles. They struck flint. The torches flared into violent, oily life. They took a step toward the wooden porch. Silas raised the rifle to his shoulder. He aimed directly through the heavy oak of the door, calculating the height of the chieftain's chest on the other side. He rested his finger on the cold iron trigger. He took a breath. He held it. He was ready to pay the toll. Before the two orcs could reach the steps, a sound echoed from the tree line. It was not a battle cry. It was the sharp metallic snap of a rifle bolt locking into place. Then came another, and another, and another. A cascade of mechanical clicks echoing from the dense pines to the east, the rocky ridge to the west, and the thick brush behind the cavalry's rear flank. The orc chieftain halted. He raised a massive fist. The two men with the torches stopped dead in their tracks. The war wargs pinned their ears back, whining nervously, smelling a sudden shift in the wind. Slowly, deliberately, figures began to step out from the shadows of the winter forest. They were not soldiers. They did not wear uniforms. It was Miller the blacksmith from the Valley settlement, 10 miles down the river, his massive leather apron tied over a heavy wool coat, a double-barreled shotgun resting easily against his hip. It was Old Man Henderson, the beekeeper, holding a scoped hunting rifle with hands that had worked the land for 60 years. It was the local farrier, the grain merchants, the trappers, the men who carved a living out of the unforgiving Nevada rock. There were nearly 30 of them. They formed a massive, silent ring entirely surrounding the Iron Fang cavalry. They did not shout threats. They did not wave their weapons. They simply stood there, their rifles and shotguns leveled squarely at the armored backs of the orc riders. Inside the cabin, Silas lowered his rifle an inch. He peered through the frosted glass. His jaw tightened. These were men who kept to themselves. Men who had fought in the border wars and had the scars to prove it. Men who hated orcs, but Silas was one of them. Over the decades, Silas had left a quarter of a butchered elk on Henderson's porch when the winter was lean. He had helped Miller rebuild his forge after a roof collapse. He had guided their sons back from the deep timber when the blizzards hit. He had never asked for a dime. He had never asked for a favor. And now the valley had come to collect on the silence. They had seen the green-skinned woman carrying water from the creek. They had seen the child. They had talked in hushed voices at the general store. They knew who Silas was harboring. And when the Iron Fang war party rode through the valley at dawn, the men did not run and hide. They loaded their weapons and followed the tracks. The orc chieftain slowly turned his mount, his halberd held tight. He scanned the tree line. He was a veteran of 100 battles. He could do the math. His cavalry was heavily armored and brutally violent. They could kill a dozen of these farmers in the first rush. But at this range, completely surrounded, the crossfire would be devastating. Half his men would be blown out of their saddles before they swung an axe. And the warlord did not pay them to die in the mud for a runaway bride. "You dare," the chieftain hissed, glaring at Miller. "You risked the treaty for one piece of runaway flesh." Miller spat a stream of dark tobacco juice into the snow. He racked the pump of his shotgun. The sound was deafening in the quiet morning. "You're trespassing on my neighbor's land," Miller said simply. "Turn your dogs around, or we're going to have a very loud morning." The tension was a physical wire pulled so tight it was ready to snap and decapitate them all. A single flinch, a single panicked horse would ignite a slaughter. Inside the cabin, Valia watched the standoff through the window. She saw the human farmers. She saw Silas standing at the door ready to pull the trigger. They were going to die for her. These humans, these former enemies, were going to bleed into the snow to protect a child that was not theirs. Valia reached out. She gently pushed the barrel of Silas's rifle down. Silas looked back at her, his eyes blazing. "Don't do it, Valia. Don't open that door." "I am not surrendering, Silas," she said softly. Her voice was incredibly calm. The panic was gone. "I am ending it." She reached into the pocket of her leather tunic. She pulled out the black steel medallion. Before Silas could stop her, she unlatched the deadbolt. She pulled the heavy oak door open. The cold wind swept into the cabin. Valia stepped out onto the porch. She did not cower. She did not hide torn behind her. She stood at her full height, the cold air hitting her face. The Iron Fang cavalry shifted. Crossbows were raised. The war wargs snarled. Silas stepped out onto the porch right beside her, his rifle leveled directly at the center of the chieftain's chest. He stood shoulder to shoulder with the orc woman, presenting a united, unbreakable front. Valia raised her right hand. The black steel medallion caught the dull gray light of the sun. The chieftain's eyes narrowed behind his iron mask. "I am Valia of the Iron Fang." Her voice echoed across the clearing, slipping effortlessly into the guttural booming command of her native tongue. It carried over the wind, over the guns, over the growling beasts. "Firstborn of the bloodline, heir to the southern ridge." The chieftain sneered. "Then act like it. Come down from the wood. Submit." "I submit to nothing," Valia roared back. She walked to the edge of the wooden steps. "By the old laws, by the laws of the shattered tusk, a blood heir who refuses the call does not return in chains." The chieftain went completely still. The orc riders behind him murmured, shifting uncomfortably in their saddles. They knew the old laws. They were older than the warlord. They were etched into the bones of their religion. "A blood heir who refuses," Valia continued, her voice echoing off the mountains, "claims the right of severance. I claim it now." She held the heavy black steel medallion in both hands, her massive muscles bunched. "Are you insane?" the chieftain spat. "You sever the line, you are nothing. You are exile. You are dirt. The clan will never recognize you. The warlord will strip your name from the stones." "Let him," Valia said. With a brutal, violent twist of her wrists, Valia wrenched the black steel. The metal groaned. It fought her. She bared her teeth, her arms shaking with the immense effort, the scars on her shoulders burning white. With a sharp, deafening crack, the medallion snapped entirely in half. The royal seal of the Iron Fang was broken. Silence crashed down upon the clearing. It was an absolute, terrifying stillness. To the orcs, she had just committed an act of supreme blasphemy. She had erased her own existence. Valia threw the two broken pieces of heavy black steel into the snow at the front hooves of the chieftain's war. The princess of the Iron Fang is dead, Valia said. Her voice was not a shout anymore. It was a cold, quiet promise. There is only a mother here. Tell your warlord his bride is a ghost. If you want blood, step off your beast and try to take it. But know that you will die on this porch, and your men will die in this clearing. She looked at Silas. She looked at the ring of 30 human rifles aimed from the trees. The chieftain stared down at the broken pieces of the medallion in the snow. His jaw tightened behind the iron mask. He had his answer. Under the ancient laws, she was dead to the clan. He had no legal mandate to drag an exile back. He had no desire to die in a crossfire with 30 entrenched human marksmen. The warlord would rage, but the warlord was safe in his stone fortress hundreds of miles away. The chieftain spat onto the broken metal. He yanked the reins of his war-warg. The massive beast pivoted sharply, throwing up a spray of ice and mud. You are nothing, the chieftain hissed at Valieri. You will die out here in the cold, and no ancestors will sing your name. I prefer the quiet, Valia answered. The chieftain raised his hand. He signaled the retreat. Slowly, deliberately, the Iron Fang cavalry turned their mounts. They did not look back. They urged their beasts forward, pushing past the tree line, disappearing back into the mist from which they had come. The thunder of hooves slowly faded down the mountain pass until there was nothing left but the sound of the wind. In the tree line, Miller lowered his shotgun. He looked at Silas on the porch. The blacksmith gave a single slow nod. Silas nodded back. No words were exchanged. No grand speeches of gratitude. The farmers and trappers simply turned around, their boots crunching in the snow, and melted back into the forest, returning to their forges, their fields, and their quiet lives. The debt was paid. The valley had spoken. Silas lowered his rifle. He uncocked the hammer. He felt the weight of the gun in his hands, but he did not feel the weight of his past. He looked down at his left hand. It was steady. It was whole. He turned to look at Valia. She was staring out at the empty clearing, her chest heaving. She had just thrown away her entire history. She had no tribe. She had no wealth. She had no protection in a world that hated her kind. She was completely, utterly isolated. Except for the cabin. Except for the old man. Except for the boy. Silas stepped up beside her. He did not say it would be okay. He did not say it was over. Out here, nothing was ever truly over. He simply reached out his calloused, scarred hand, wrapping gently around her thick green forearm. Stew's getting cold, Silas said. Valia looked down at his hand. Then she looked at his weathered face. The edges of her mouth twitched. A long, shuddering sigh escaped her lips, carrying away the last remnants of the Iron Fang princess. It needs more salt, she whispered. Always does, Silas replied. He turned and held the door open for her. She walked back into the warmth of the cabin. Silas took one last look at the broken pieces of black steel lying in the snow. He didn't pick them up. He let the winter bury them. He stepped inside and pulled the door shut. 14 months later, the sun was warm. The bitter cold of the deep winter had finally broken, leaving the Cascade Valley painted in vibrant, aggressive greens. The mountain creek behind the cabin ran high and loud with snowmelt. Silas sat on the heavy wooden block on the porch. He was not wearing his heavy canvas coat, just a faded cotton shirt, his sleeves rolled up to the elbows. The scars on his left hand were fully visible in the sunlight, jagged and white, tracing a map of old violence across his skin. He was holding a piece of smooth river stone in his lap. He had a small, sharp chisel in his right hand. Sitting directly between his knees, completely engrossed in the work, was Torin. The boy was 3 now. He was growing fast, his shoulders broadening, his green skin absorbing the mountain sun. He was wearing a small pair of denim overalls Silas had bought in town. Hold it right here, Silas murmured, his voice a low, patient rumble. He guided Torin's small, thick hand over the grip of the chisel. Don't force it. The stone tells you where it wants to break. You just have to listen. Listen, Torin repeated seriously, his yellow eyes narrowed in absolute concentration. Silas rested his scarred left hand over Torin's. His hand was completely still. The tremor was a ghost story, a relic of a man who had died in the snow 10 years ago. The man sitting on the porch today was alive. Torrin tapped the back of the chisel with a small, wooden mallet. A tiny flake of stone chipped away. Good, Silas said, leaning back slightly. Just like that. The heavy wooden door of the cabin swung open. Valia stepped out onto the porch. She was wearing a simple, rugged dress woven from brown wool, the sleeves pushed up past her elbows. The jagged, ritualistic scars on her arms were still there, but they no longer looked like brands of ownership. They looked like history. She was carrying a heavy iron pot in both hands wrapped in a thick cloth. The smell of roasted venison, wild carrots, and crushed garlic billowed out into the fresh mountain air. She stopped near the doorframe. She leaned her massive shoulder against the wood, resting the heavy pot against her hip. She looked at the old man sitting on the chopping block. She looked at her son laughing as another piece of stone chipped away under the old hunter's patient guidance. There were no grand armies here. There were no banners, no titles, no absolute safety. The world beyond the tree line was still cruel, still unforgiving, and still dangerous. But as Valia watched Silas reach out and ruffle Torrin's hair, his scarred hands steady and warm, she knew she had made the right trade. She had lost a kingdom, but she had found a home. "Food is ready," Valia called out, her voice rich and deep, carrying a quiet, unshakable peace. Silas looked up from the stone. He met her yellow eyes. He didn't smile. He was not a man given to easy smiles, but the hard-weathered lines around his eyes softened entirely. "Come on, boy," Silas said, tapping Torrin on the shoulder. He stood up, his joints popping, and brushed the stone dust from his trousers. "Let's go see if your mother remembered the salt this time." Torrin giggled, dropping the chisel and running toward the door, wrapping his arms around Valia's legs. Valia reached down with one hand, resting it gently on the boy's head, her eyes never leaving Silas. Silas walked up the steps. He paused at the door, pulling a pipe from his pocket. He looked out over the tree line, out at the quiet, sprawling wild of the valley. The forest was silent. The ghosts were gone. Silas struck a match, lit his pipe, and stepped inside, letting the heavy oak door close softly behind him.